Willow Creek, a suburban enclave 30 minutes north of a mid-sized American city, appeared at first glance like a storybook neighborhood. Its roads curved gently amid manicured lawns, while pastel-colored houses greeted visitors with tidy front yards and matching mailboxes. There was a sense of quiet pride among residents, many of whom had lived in Willow Creek for years. But beneath the pristine veneer lay an undercurrent of tension. Much of this tension centered around the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, HOA, and, in particular, one of its more notorious members, Bernice Alexander, nicknamed by frustrated neighbors as Karen. Karen, in her late 40s, had moved into Willow Creek about 5 years ago. She quickly joined the HOA board, claiming her attention to detail would help maintain high standards. In practice, she used her position to enforce her personal tastes on everyone else. Over time, she became both feared and loathed for her meddlesome nature. She was known to snap photographs of the smallest deviations from the HOA rulebook, like a garden gnome she deemed tacky or a potted plant that didn't match the recommended color palette. Despite this, Willow Creek was still a mostly pleasant place, and many neighbors tolerated or tried to ignore Karen's antics. Yet all illusions of tolerance would soon be shattered by her brazen act of sabotage against a neighbor's access ramp. For Karen, it was a quest for symmetry. For everyone else, it was a shocking violation that would catalyze a dramatic neighborhood showdown. Karen's obsession revolved around uniformity, no matter how impractical or trivial it might be. She believed that everything in Willow Creek, from hedges to mailboxes to fence lines, should align perfectly for the best curb appeal. She studied the HOA guidelines tirelessly, highlighting sections about aesthetic harmony. Over time, she twisted these guidelines to reinforce her personal dogma, sending out notice of violation letters at the slightest excuse. Some residents muttered that Karen's perfectionism bordered on pathological. Indeed, behind her bright smile lurked an almost militant fixation on the precise geometry of lawns and porches. She insisted that each house's front yard should mirror its neighbors as closely as possible, even though the HOA never actually required such a level of conformity. The real trouble began when Karen discovered that one house on Lilybrook Lane, belonging to a relatively new resident named Michelle Foster, had a front porch ramp that extended a few inches further on one side, an intentional design to accommodate the unique angle of the driveway. Michelle's mother, an elderly woman named Clara who used a walker, visited frequently. The ramp provided her with a safe way to enter the home. But to Karen, that ramp corner was a glaring eyesore, wrecking the tidy geometry of the neighborhood. Michelle Foster was a soft-spoken woman in her 30s, a freelance graphic designer who cherished the laid-back atmosphere Willow Creek appeared to offer. She moved in 6 months earlier, unaware of the HOA's stricter interpretations. When she bought the house, it already had a simple, functional front porch ramp that angled slightly to accommodate both the walkway and the driveway's slope. Previous owners had built it years ago, presumably to help an elderly relative or perhaps someone in a wheelchair. It was up to code and unobtrusive, just a standard wooden ramp with a railing. Michelle liked its practicality. She often rolled groceries up the ramp instead of carrying heavy bags up the steps. Most importantly, it allowed her mother, Clara, to visit comfortably. Clara's knees weren't what they used to be, and even a small set of stairs could be daunting. From the day Michelle moved in, Karen's critical gaze lingered on that ramp corner, which extended a bit beyond the porch's rectangle. While most neighbors considered the ramp a perfectly normal adaptation, Karen saw it as an affront to the uniform design of the block. She snapped photos from various angles, printed them, and kept them in a folder labeled Ramp Violation, Lilybrook number 42. In her mind, the ramp's asymmetry disrupted the entire street's facade, like a crooked tile on a perfect mosaic. A week after Michelle settled into her home, she found a note pinned to her front door. Dear Ms. Foster, this is a reminder from Willow Creek HOA that all structural modifications to the front of your property must adhere to guidelines for uniform appearance. It appears your ramp juts beyond the porch perimeter, creating an asymmetrical frontage. Please correct this discrepancy or submit plans for a ramp that aligns with the neighborhood's established aesthetic. Best regards, Karen, Compliance Committee. Michelle, puzzled, did some research. She discovered that the official HOA rulebook only required that ramps adhere to local building codes. Her ramp was fully to code. The county had approved it long ago. No official clause demanded a perfectly symmetrical porch design. Recognizing this as an overreach, Michelle politely emailed the HOA's general inbox, inquiring if she truly needed to make any changes. She attached photos and city documents proving it complied with accessibility guidelines. An HOA representative, not Karen, responded a few days later. Your ramp is code compliant and poses no violation under Willow Creek, HOA's official standards. No action required. Relieved, Michelle thought that was the end of it. Yet from across the street, she often glimpsed Karen glaring at the ramp. It was an unsettling feeling, but with no further official complaint, Michelle tried to dismiss her worries. She had no inkling how far Karen's obsession would eventually go. Unbeknownst to Michelle, Karen had begun cataloging every potential argument for forcing a ramp redesign. She scribbled in her notebook phrases like property values, visual uniformity, and disruptive to neighborhood design. She also took careful measurements, pacing the distance from the sidewalk to the porch, comparing it to adjacent houses, trying to prove that the ramp stuck out too far. Her ultimate grievance was that one corner extended an extra 8 inches beyond the natural line of the porch. 8 inches that, in Karen's mind, ruined the perfect alignment with the next house's fence. It didn't matter to her that the ramp's angled extension helped accommodate Clara's walker on uneven ground. Karen believed that if a ramp were needed at all, it should remain within the rectangular porch dimensions, no matter the practicality. In her zeal, Karen ignored that local building codes frequently require angled or extended ramps for safety and ease of access. Instead, she fantasized about a single geometric line running across the entire row of houses, with porches meticulously aligned and no feature, like a ramp daring to break that imaginary boundary. Karen's campaign of letter writing escalated, but the HOA board repeatedly sided with Michelle, referencing county codes. Each denial only sharpened Karen's resentment, driving her to consider more drastic methods. She'd spent years pushing smaller, more timid neighbors around. But Michelle, backed by the board's leniency, refused to cave. One Saturday afternoon, Michelle's mother, Clara, arrived for a weekend stay. Despite her knee pain, she loved traveling to Michelle's new place and admired the quiet atmosphere of Willow Creek. The ramp proved incredibly helpful. Clara could walk up at her own pace, leaning on her walker or holding the railing. Karen happened to see Clara inching up the ramp. She stood in her driveway, arms crossed, lips thin. Later that day, Karen sent another letter. Ms. Foster, I've observed usage of the front ramp that may pose a hazard if not perfectly constructed. The corner extension doesn't appear standard, and someone using a walker might catch a wheel on that protrusion. We strongly recommend realigning or removing the extension to prevent possible injuries and maintain a consistent frontage. Regards, Karen, Willow Creek HOA Compliance. Michelle had never heard of a walker catching on a ramp corner in any real sense, especially when that corner was specifically designed to allow smoother entry. She read the letter in disbelief. This time, she didn't bother emailing the HOA. She saw it as a personal vendetta from Karen. In a calm but firm tone, she left Karen a voicemail stating the ramp was safe, code-compliant, and beneficial to her mother. She asked Karen to stop harassing her with these unfounded complaints. Of course, that only enraged Karen more. She despised being dismissed and had grown accustomed to neighbors bending to her will. The stage was set for Karen's shocking solution. It happened on a warm spring night. The sun had set, and Willow Creek's streetlights cast gentle circles of illumination on the quiet roads. Michelle sat in her living room, finishing a design project. Clara was fast asleep in the guest room, her walker folded neatly by the bedside. Outside, a mild breeze ruffled the leaves. All seemed peaceful, yet across the street, Karen was stewing. She could no longer tolerate that protruding ramp corner. The HOA wouldn't back her. Michelle refused to budge. In Karen's mind, there was only one way to fix the ramp's symmetry breach: forcibly remove the offending piece of wood. Shortly before midnight, Karen slipped out her back door, carrying a small handsaw and a battery-operated jigsaw, tools she typically reserved for home improvements. She wore dark jeans, a hoodie, and gardening gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints. Her heart hammered with adrenaline as she crept across the street toward Michelle's property. Checking to ensure no lights were on, Karen carefully approached the ramp. She stooped at the corner where the extension angled outward. She switched on the jigsaw and pressed it against the wood. The whir of the blade tore through the air, loud, but Karen hoped Michelle was too far inside to hear. She cut swiftly around the ramp's edge, severing the portion that extended beyond Karen's desired alignment. The wooden scrap dropped onto the grass with a dull thud. Breathing heavily, Karen surveyed her handiwork. A new, sharply cut edge was now in place, though rough, jagged, and dangerously unsanded. Karen rationalized that she'd improved the ramp, making it symmetrical. In truth, she'd left a crude hazard. She snatched up the severed wood piece and hurried back to her house, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She had no idea what consequences she had just unleashed. At sunrise, Michelle stepped onto her porch to water potted flowers. The moment her eyes landed on the ramp, she froze. The side portion was missing. Someone had sawed it off, leaving a ragged, uneven cut. Splinters jutted out dangerously, and small wood shavings dotted the nearby grass. Alarmed, she carefully stooped to examine it. There was no mistaking the fresh saw marks. Her heart pounded. Who would do such a thing? The immediate suspect came to mind: Karen. But why sabotage a ramp? Michelle's fear turned to anger as she realized Clara might have stepped onto this ramp in the early morning, risking a fall. This was more than vandalism. It was a direct threat to her mother's safety and her own. Michelle called the non-emergency police line. An officer arrived and took photos. He advised her to file an official report, acknowledging it was clearly an act of trespassing and property damage. The officer also suggested installing a security camera or motion sensor lights, given the suspicious nature of the sabotage. Rattled, Michelle contacted the HOA board, explaining what happened. Though the board was shocked, they had no official policy about private acts of vandalism. They could only condemn it and suggest Michelle file a complaint with city authorities. Furious, Michelle drafted an email to Karen, accusing her directly. She doubted Karen would admit guilt, but she needed her to know this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek. Vandalizing a front porch ramp, especially one used by an elderly visitor, crossed a line that many residents found appalling. A handful of neighbors stepped forward to say that late at night, they had noticed a figure lurking near Michelle's house, but couldn't identify them. Others were certain it had to be Karen, given her vocal objections to the ramp. The neighborhood's online forum lit up with angry posts. People typed messages like, "This is a new low, even for Karen." Someone literally took a saw to a disabled access ramp? That's criminal. We need to support Michelle and stand against such bullying. Karen, for her part, kept a low profile. She did not appear at the next HOA meeting. She ignored Michelle's accusatory email. But behind the scenes, she tried to spin the story, telling a few sympathetic acquaintances that the ramp was dangerous anyway, and that someone must have trimmed it for public safety. A few believed her twisted account, but most saw right through it. Meanwhile, Michelle installed security cameras, ensuring no further vandalism would go unseen. She covered the ramp's jagged edge with a temporary plank so her mother could still visit safely. Yet the emotional toll remained. The sense of violation was profound. Soon after the sabotage, a small group of neighbors led by Rena Rodriguez banded together to support Michelle. They offered to help rebuild the ramp or at least patch the damage properly. Rena, a retired contractor, volunteered to do an initial repair free of charge. However, they realized that a more significant fix might be needed to restore both safety and aesthetics. Rena proposed, "We could hire a professional landscaper or builder to create a brand new ramp that meets code and looks fantastic, like a real statement piece that the HOA can't possibly oppose. She pointed out that if they designed it well, they could incorporate symmetrical flower beds or decorative rails to appease the board's general preference for neatness. Though outraged at having to spend money on something that was already functional, Michelle saw the benefits. The sabotage had left the ramp structurally compromised. Rather than just patch it up, building a new, more elaborate ramp could ensure her mother's safety, and also send a message that Willow Creek wouldn't tolerate bullying. Several neighbors offered donations. Rena launched a small crowdfunding campaign on the community's social media page, explaining what happened. Within days, they raised enough to hire a reputable landscaping and carpentry firm. Michelle felt both gratitude and renewed hope. It was a silver lining in this dark episode. Neighbors were uniting against Karen's cruelty. Michelle and Rena met with Green Crafters, a local landscaping and home improvement company. The lead designer, Eli Thompson, listened intently to the story behind the sabotage. Outraged, he immediately pledged to help create a ramp that would be safe, visually appealing, and fully code compliant. The plan included a uniform slope that met ADA guidelines, ensuring any walker or wheelchair could navigate easily. Decorative wrought iron rails running along the sides, giving the ramp a stylish flair. Floral planters at the base of each side, featuring low-maintenance, symmetrical flower beds, perfect for tying into Willow Creek's love of tidy aesthetics. Matching wood materials for the porch and ramp blended seamlessly so it looked like an intentional design element rather than an afterthought. They also discussed a small arch at the entrance of the ramp, a tasteful, optional feature that could align with the style of Michelle's house. "We'll do everything by the book," Eli assured her. "If the HOA loves uniformity, we'll give them symmetrical planters and a balanced look that's impossible to criticize." Michelle felt a spark of excitement. Rather than dwelling on the damage, they were transforming the ramp into a neighborhood highlight. If Karen's goal was to remove the extension, she was about to be sorely disappointed. The new ramp would be both bigger and more prominent, yet undeniably elegant. When the HOA board learned of the new ramp project, they saw the design sketches and were impressed. Mr. Walters, the board president, even said this could become a model for accessible home modifications in Willow Creek. He was sympathetic to Michelle's ordeal, though the board still lacked hard evidence to formally blame Karen for vandalism. Karen was conspicuously absent from the next board meeting. When another board member asked if they should investigate the sabotage more vigorously, Mr. Walters explained that without security footage or a witness, any accusation remained speculative. Nonetheless, he made a public statement condemning the vandalism and pledging to support Michelle's right to rebuild. Privately, the board members exchanged worried glances. They knew Karen was capable of extreme meddling, but property damage was a criminal matter outside their authority. Their main recourse was to endorse the new ramp design and ensure nobody contested it. They swiftly approved any required paperwork. The official stance became, the board wholeheartedly supports this accessible and aesthetically pleasing upgrade. On a crisp Monday morning, Green Crafters arrived at Michelle's home to start demolition of the old ramp. Although it felt bittersweet to see the original ramp, now defaced, torn down, Michelle found solace in the knowledge that a better, safer structure would rise in its place. Rena and a few neighbors stopped by to lend moral support, bringing snacks for the crew and offering words of encouragement. Eli and his team worked swiftly. They removed the jagged remnants, carefully disposing of any rotted or damaged sections. By midday, the porch looked strangely bare. Next came the framing for the new ramp, meticulously leveled and anchored to the porch's existing supports. The symmetrical planters were partially built, each side a mirror image of the other, thus ensuring uniformity from the front view. As hammers pounded and saws buzzed, Michelle wondered how Karen might react when she realized a far more elaborate ramp was taking shape. She also reflected on how the community had rallied around her, turning what could have been a lonely, frightening experience into a demonstration of neighborly unity. Across the street, Karen watched from behind her curtains, mouth set in a grim line. Day after day, she witnessed the construction, sawwood beams rising, symmetrical planters taking form, and elegant railings being installed. She recognized the irony. Her efforts to remove that extra corner had spurred a total overhaul, making the ramp even more prominent. A flurry of emotions coursed through Karen. Anger that the HOA approved this expansion, humiliation of being sidelined from the process, and a twisted sense of betrayal that the neighbors celebrated a design that, in her eyes, still marred the block's uniform line. She mulled whether to lodge new complaints, but the board had already granted approval. With the entire community seemingly supporting Michelle, Karen felt isolated. Some nights, Karen paced her living room, drafting letters she never sent, rants about visual clutter and ramps that overshadow neighboring porches. She knew they'd be dismissed. The more Karen brooded, the more she realized she might have overstepped. Yet she clung to her belief that she was protecting the neighborhood. Self-reflection hardly came easily to her. Midway through construction, the project faced a hiccup. The county building inspector visited to ensure the ramp's slope, railings, and foundation met safety standards. During the inspection, the inspector noticed deep saw marks on the porch railing, ones that looked fresh, as if someone had tried to cut further into the porch overnight. Michelle and the team stood stunned. None of them had done that. It seemed someone, likely Karen, had returned under cover of darkness, possibly intending more sabotage. Fortunately, the damage was minor and limited to the porch rail, not the new ramp structure. The inspector raised an eyebrow, but since it hadn't compromised safety, he simply recommended an extra bracket for reinforcement. Michelle was furious, but also relieved the ramp was unharmed. She filed another police report. This time, her newly installed security camera had captured a shadowy figure on the porch around 2 a.m. The footage was blurry, but the silhouette and stature looked suspiciously like Karen's. The police said they'd investigate further. Fearing further interference, Rena arranged a rotating watch of neighbors who'd occasionally stroll by in the late evenings. The community wasn't about to let Karen sabotage the project again. The sense of unity only grew stronger. After nearly 2 weeks of meticulous work, the new ramp was complete. The final design featured a gently sloping platform with sturdy, decorative rails on both sides. At the base of the ramp, 2 symmetrical flower beds curved outward, filled with blooming petunias and lavender. An attractive arch rose at the top, framing the entrance with a subtle elegance that matched Michelle's porch style. Every piece of wood was stained a rich cedar hue, sealed against the elements. On a bright Saturday morning, neighbors gathered in Michelle's front yard for a small ramp reveal. Rena offered a brief speech, thanking everyone who donated or volunteered. "In this neighborhood, we stand up for each other," she declared, her voice carrying across the lawn. A round of applause followed. Clara, visiting again, was the first to test the ramp. She walked up slowly, marveling at how smooth and solid it felt. Reaching the porch, she turned, tears shimmering in her eyes. "This is beautiful," she said, "and it's safe. Thank you all so much." The crowd clapped, cheered, and took photos. Michelle's heart swelled with gratitude. Though it had come from a place of destruction, the new ramp felt like a triumph of community spirit. And as if to underscore that triumph, an email arrived later that day from Mr. Walters, the HOA president, praising the project as an example of thoughtful design that enhances neighborhood appeal. The same Saturday afternoon, Karen stood at her window, watching the small gathering on Michelle's lawn. She bristled at the applause. What she perceived as a rightful fight for uniformity had ended in a humiliating public event celebrating a ramp that was more elaborate, and from her perspective, even more visually prominent than before. She tried to console herself with the notion that at least the overall shape was symmetrical now, but in her eyes, the presence of a ramp at all disrupted the block's original lines. She recalled how she'd sliced off that corner, believing she'd fixed the problem. Instead, she'd only triggered a bigger project. She slammed her fist against the windowsill. "Why can't they see I was right?" she thought. That evening, Karen typed an angry letter to the HOA board, accusing them of endorsing excessive modifications that overshadow the neighborhood's intended uniform design. She threatened to petition for stricter guidelines on external ramps, but a wave of exhaustion hit her. She guessed it would be fruitless, given the board's clear stance. She never sent the letter. Instead, she sank into a restless gloom, grappling with her unraveling sense of control. Days later, 2 police officers knocked on Karen's door. The department had finally retrieved the security camera footage from Michelle's porch, the night someone tried to saw further into the railing. While the figure's face was hidden, the body shape and posture strongly resembled Karen. Further, digital forensics indicated that a phone used near Michelle's property matched signals from Karen's phone around that same time. Karen denied everything. She claimed to have been asleep and that any phone data must be a coincidence. The officers left, stating that the investigation remained open, but charges wouldn't be filed without conclusive proof. Nevertheless, word spread that Karen was the prime suspect for the second sabotage attempt too. This escalated the neighborhood's wariness of Karen. Parents told their kids not to wander near her house. Some neighbors scowled if they spotted her or turned away. Karen became the target of hushed gossip, no longer wielding the intimidation factor she once did. Any goodwill she'd built up over the years evaporated. Though not formally charged, she bore the brunt of public condemnation. A week after the ramp was completed, Michelle surprised everyone by leaving a small gift basket on Karen's porch. A mix of homemade cookies, a note reading, "I hope we can move forward peacefully. All I want is for my mother to visit safely." Michelle, when Karen found it, she was initially suspicious. She half expected a hidden message or a snide remark. But the note was sincere. Despite everything, Michelle seemed willing to try for a civil coexistence. Karen stared at the cookies, feeling an uncomfortable mix of guilt and resentment. She didn't publicly respond. That evening, she left the basket in her kitchen, nibbling a cookie in secret. For a fleeting moment, she felt a pang of remorse for how far things had gone. However, pride wouldn't let her apologize or reach out to Michelle. Instead, she retreated further into isolation. Encouraged by Willow Creek's residents, Mr. Walters and the rest of the board decided to release an official statement addressing the vandalism and the new ramp. Dear Willow Creek residents, we do not condone any acts of sabotage or vandalism against home modifications that adhere to local and HOA guidelines. Recent events surrounding the Foster family's front porch ramp highlight the importance of ensuring both accessibility and a cohesive neighborhood aesthetic. We applaud the community effort to rebuild a ramp that is both safe and visually appealing. Let this serve as a reminder that while we strive for uniformity, we also value creativity, practicality, and neighborly cooperation. Any further incidents of vandalism will be met with the strongest condemnation. Sincerely, the Willow Creek HOA Board. Signed by Mr. Walters, President. The letter circulated via email, pinned on the neighborhood's bulletin boards, and posted to the official HOA website. Although it didn't name Karen, it was a clear rebuke of her approach. Neighbors read it as a direct affirmation that accessibility and community well-being mattered more than Karen's rigid concept of symmetry. In the weeks that followed, Willow Creek experienced a surprising transformation. Several older residents, inspired by the success of Michelle's ramp, decided to modify their porches too. A couple, who used a wheelchair occasionally, consulted with green crafters to add a small ramp to their side entrance. Another neighbor installed handrails on their porch steps to help a visiting relative with arthritis. The stigma of having non-uniform accessibility additions began to fade. The board set up a streamlined permit process for accessibility-related modifications, ensuring no one would have to jump through excessive hoops. The new message: we're a community that supports each other's needs. Karen watched these developments bitterly. The momentum of positive change meant her old tactics, citing uniformity to block ramps or railings, no longer found traction. Residents welcomed the new acceptance of personalized, practical designs. Michelle's mother, Clara, had a birthday coming up. Normally, Clara didn't like fuss. But given the events of the past weeks, Michelle decided to throw a small celebration at her home, inviting a handful of neighbors. On a sunny Saturday, a modest gathering formed in Michelle's front yard. Guests admired the new ramp, decorated with balloons and ribbons. They brought small gifts for Clara, flowers, homemade jam, cards. Clara beamed, touched by the warmth of the neighbors she barely knew. As they sang Happy Birthday, Karen could see the cluster from her window. She told herself it was an eyesore, people mingling on the lawn, the ramp decked out in decorations. Yet a thread of envy pulled at her heart. She had once wanted Willow Creek to be a perfect place, but her methods had exiled her from the very community she'd aimed to shape. She closed her curtains, refusing to watch further. Rumors circulated that Karen might move away to start fresh. Some neighbors reported seeing a real estate agent visiting her home. Others dismissed the talk as mere speculation. Karen remained tight-lipped, but her yard grew uncharacteristically untidy. Grass a little longer, flower beds less perfectly pruned, an uncharacteristic disarray for someone so fixated on aesthetics. Michelle hoped, in a small way, that Karen might find a path to redemption. Maybe apologize, maybe embrace a more communal spirit. But as weeks passed, that hope faded. Karen stayed reclusive, apparently resentful that the community had rallied around the ramp she'd tried to destroy. Meanwhile, Michelle thrived. She enjoyed a newly expanded client base for her graphic design work, thanks to local referrals from neighbors who admired her resilience. Clara visited more frequently, delighted by the ramp's ease. The wound of the sabotage still lingered, but with each day, the new ramp and the neighbors' kindness overshadowed those dark memories. One evening, a light knock on Michelle's door surprised her. She opened it to find Karen, standing stiffly, holding an envelope. Michelle's stomach tightened. Karen handed over the envelope with minimal eye contact. Inside was a typed letter with official-looking formatting. Ms. Foster, while we have had our differences, I want to formally acknowledge that your new porch ramp meets all guidelines set forth by Willow Creek HOA. I also recognize your right to ensure safe access for family members. Signed, Bernice Alexander, Karen. Compliance Committee, former. The signature included the word former, indicating that Karen was likely no longer on the committee. Michelle reread it, unsure whether this letter was an apology or just a forced acknowledgement. Nonetheless, it was the first direct communication from Karen since the sabotage. Michelle thanked her quietly, unsure what else to say. Karen nodded once, turned around, and left without further explanation. It wasn't exactly a warm reconciliation, but it signaled a possible end to active hostilities. Michelle closed the door, a mix of relief and pity swirling inside her. Perhaps that was as close to contrition as Karen could manage. With autumn approaching, Willow Creek organized its annual harvest fair, a small event with hayrides, craft stalls, and local vendors selling pies and seasonal produce. The highlight was always a best porch contest, where residents decorated their porches in fall themes. Pumpkins, scarecrows, wreaths, and corn stalks appeared across the neighborhood. Michelle decided to join for the first time. She and Clara draped their new ramp in autumn garlands, placing symmetrical pumpkin displays on either side of the flower beds. The effect was striking. Orange and gold leaves twined around the wrought iron rails, capturing the essence of the season. When judges came by, they were impressed by how the ramp integrated so harmoniously into the overall porch design. In a nod to the ramp story, Michelle included a small sign that read, "Accessibility is beautiful. Welcome to our porch." On the day awards were announced, Michelle was stunned to hear her name called. She'd won Most Festive Porch, recognized for how well the ramp and decorations complemented the autumn flair. The crowd cheered as she accepted a modest plaque, grinning from ear to ear. Clara clapped excitedly, tears of pride in her eyes. Meanwhile, Karen lingered at the edge of the gathering, arms folded, face inscrutable. Some said they glimpsed a flicker of regret in her gaze. But she offered no applause, no smile. Winter rolled in, bringing a dusting of snow to Willow Creek. Michelle found that even in icy conditions, The new ramp's railings and well-sealed planks provided safe footing for Clara. Neighbors occasionally helped shovel the ramp, sprinkling salt to keep it slip-free. The sense of community remained strong. Karen rarely ventured outdoors. Her house lights stayed off most evenings, and rumors of her moving persisted. The once ever-present force of the HOA, the Karen, seemed almost a ghost in the neighborhood. Yet the ramp continued its quiet influence. Other homes installed similarly styled ramps or step railings, each blending safety with design. Willow Creek was evolving from a place that prized uniformity for uniformity's sake into one that recognized the beauty of inclusive, personalized touches. By springtime, the police concluded their investigation. Though they couldn't produce a conclusive identification of Karen in the security footage, the circumstantial evidence was strong enough that they referred the case to the district attorney's office for potential charges of property damage and trespassing. Ultimately, the DA decided not to prosecute. Lack of crystal-clear identification was a barrier in court. However, the public knowledge of that near indictment destroyed any last shred of Karen's credibility in Willow Creek. Most neighbors chose to shun her. She lost her seat on the HOA board. If she still craved control or recognition, she no longer found it here. Michelle didn't celebrate Karen's downfall. She took no pleasure in another person's isolation. But she remained relieved that no further harm could come from Karen's meddling. The ramp fiasco had tested the community, and it emerged stronger. Eli Thompson from Green Crafters returned for a follow-up, offering a complimentary power wash and reseal of the ramp after its first winter. He admired how well the structure had held up and the vibrant flowers in the planters. "I think we set a record," he joked, "most photographed ramp in Willow Creek." Michelle grinned, recalling how neighbors often complimented the ramp or asked about the design. "You did a wonderful job. It's become more than just a practical necessity. It's a part of my home's character." Eli agreed. "It's amazing how adversity can spark something beautiful. That's basically the definition of your porch now." Indeed, the ramp had transformed from a point of contention into a symbol of resilience. Every time Clara visited, she'd say with a laugh, "I can't believe someone tried to get rid of this. It's the prettiest ramp I've ever seen." Summer arrived, and the for sale sign finally appeared on Karen's lawn. A few neighbors watched as prospective buyers toured the house. It remained on the market for weeks, perhaps due to Karen's high asking price or the stigma attached to her name. Eventually, a family from out of town made an offer. Karen accepted. On a quiet Tuesday morning, a moving truck arrived. Karen stepped out briefly to supervise, face drawn and tired. She glanced over at Michelle's porch, where the ramp sat in the sunlight, flower beds in full bloom. Michelle, returning from a jog, caught Karen's eye and offered a tentative wave. Karen merely looked away, disappearing into her house. By the end of the day, Karen was gone, leaving behind a neighborhood that had changed in her wake. Some felt relief, others felt pity. The final chapter of her disruptive influence closed, replaced by the warm sense that Willow Creek belonged to its residents, not to the dictates of one controlling personality. Within a week, a new family moved in across from Michelle, the Thompsons, not related to Eli, the landscaper. They had 2 teenage kids, a friendly dog, and an immediate enthusiasm for Willow Creek's block parties and communal events. They introduced themselves with homemade cupcakes, quickly bonding with the neighbors who once feared Karen's watchful presence. Michelle found it surreal how much calmer the street felt. No more prying stares from behind curtains. No more petty violation letters. The ramp was simply part of the neighborhood's landscape now, welcomed, admired, and never questioned. Friends teased that Michelle should rename her porch the ramp that brought us together. One evening, as Michelle sat on the porch with Clara, they gazed at the sunset, painting the sky in pink and orange hues. Clara's walker rested beside her, though she preferred the ramp to keep her knees from flaring up. Neighbors strolled by, waving or stopping to chat. Children laughed, riding bikes on the sidewalk, free from fear of receiving some petty complaint. "Remember that day we found the ramp sod?" Clara said softly, shaking her head. "Hard to imagine how far we've come." Michelle nodded. mind traveling back to that morning's shock, followed by the community's united response. If not for that awful act, we wouldn't have this beautiful ramp or the deeper bonds with our neighbors. Clara patted her daughter's hand. Sometimes the worst things bring out the best in people. Michelle smiled, reflecting on Rena's help, the donations, the unwavering support. The entire fiasco had ignited a chain reaction that turned Willow Creek into a more compassionate and inclusive community. A place unafraid to stand against those who tear others down in the name of misguided ideals. The story of Karen versus the ramp became something of a local legend. Newcomers to Willow Creek heard retellings of how a meddling HOA member tried to forcibly remove a corner of a porch ramp for symmetry, but instead inspired an even grander design. The Symmetry Wars, some jokingly called it. Over time, that phrase encompassed more than the ramp saga. It came to symbolize how rigid uniformity gave way to a more flexible, people-centric approach. The HOA, under Mr. Walter's continuing leadership, developed a friendly set of guidelines that balance curb appeal with the varied needs of families, seniors, and disabled visitors. Custom touches, once frowned upon, blossomed throughout the neighborhood. Whimsical mailboxes, small garden murals, front porch swings, and yes, more ramps or step railings were needed. On her final visit to Willow Creek, about a year after the sabotage, the county building inspector returned for a routine check of accessible modifications. He recognized Michelle's porch ramp from the local news coverage it once generated. "Still holding up great, I see," he remarked, tapping the sturdy railing. Michelle nodded. "We've had no issues. We keep it maintained, and the new owners across the street are supportive too." He scribbled a quick approval, giving a thumbs up before heading to his next stop. As he drove away, Michelle let out a contented sigh. The ramp was now just a normal, respected part of the house, no longer the center of drama. Yet its very existence stood as a testament to neighborly solidarity, a symbol of what Willow Creek had learned. That real community means accommodating differences rather than erasing them. Another summer breezed through Willow Creek, bringing block parties and potluck gatherings. Michelle's porch often served as a social hub. Neighbors who once cowered under Karen's watch now delighted in communal laughter. Teens made chalk art on the sidewalks. Seniors swapped plant cuttings. Families borrowed each other's tools. Clara became a semi-regular resident, spending half her time at Michelle's place to enjoy the sense of fellowship. She found friends among other older neighbors. Sometimes they'd gather on the newly installed benches near the community garden, chatting about days gone by and the changing face of Willow Creek. Late at night, Michelle would stand at her ramp, gazing at the moonlit street, peaceful, inviting, and free from the tension that once brewed across the way. She felt grateful that even the darkest attempt at sabotage couldn't extinguish the fundamental warmth of a neighborhood that refused to be dictated by one person's restrictive vision. In the end, Karen's bizarre quest for neighborhood symmetry backfired spectacularly. By literally sawing off the corner of Michelle's ramp, she triggered a chain of events that not only replaced the old ramp, but led to a more splendid and community-approved design, one that garnered praise from the HOA and set a new standard for inclusive, attractive home modifications. What Karen intended as an act of sabotage became a catalyst for transformation. The dangerously jagged edge she left behind symbolized the folly of forcing uniformity at the expense of humanity. And the charming new ramp with decorative rails and symmetrical flower beds grew into a celebrated emblem of Willow Creek's evolving identity, where practicality, accessibility, and beauty could coexist without fear. Long after Karen's departure, neighbors told new arrivals the tale of how an overzealous HOA member once tried to remove a vital piece of someone's home, only for the entire community to rally and build something far better. They'd point to Michelle's porch ramp, still shining in the afternoon sun, and say with a knowing smile, "That's the ramp that won the day."